Hello and welcome back to Astrology TV. In the previous video, we took the moon through the various zodiac signs and I tried to delineate the most common qualities of the moon in the signs. And as you'll find in reality, of course, not everybody is going to be exactly as I said with the moon in any particular sign. And this is also the case as I'm going to take you in this video with the moon through the houses. But I do find that in general, sometimes it doesn't matter so much what sign the moon is in a particular house. There are a lot more similarities, maybe only slightly so, because of course you can never take one planet or sign out of context of the entire horoscope. What makes everybody unique in who they are is looking at the entire horoscope chart to determine perhaps whether some things are true or not. Now, in general, with the moon in the first house, you're going to find people who are very in touch with their emotions. The first house deals with the self. And with the moon in a house that deals with their self and their own character and personality to many degrees, you are going to find someone who puts their emotions first. So they can be extra emotional no matter what the sign is, and that may be for good or bad for sure. Of course, how good or how bad will depend on how the moon is aspected in the first house. But in general, the moon in first house people, they seek to have deeper emotional attachments and relationships with people usually, no matter the sign. And of course, even when it's afflicted, sometimes those emotional attachments aren't necessarily good or healthy. When it's well aspected, generally the emotional attachments are going to be much more positive. So for sure, you're going to have people that may be very close to their mother or maybe very motherly as well, no matter the sign. Even the signs that aren't normally so motherly, when the moon is in the first house, they may tend to be more nurturing and more caring in that regard. Now, in some signs or with some aspects, they may be a little bit more emotionally selfish as well. But again, that depends quite a bit on the horoscope. Just know that moon in the first house, there's increased emotionality in the character and personality usually, whether that's for good or for bad. With the moon in the second house, perhaps similar to the moon in Taurus, there is more of an attachment to money and material resources when the moon is in the second house. In fact, there may be a very deep innate need to amass material wealth or to be extra attached to it, because the moon does represent some insecurities. So with the moon in the second house, there is a little bit of vulnerability always with the moon. So there could be vulnerability in finances with the moon in the second house. People, especially if the moon is afflicted, perhaps they may be emotional spenders. And it could be possible that depending on the sign and other afflictions, or other aspects in the chart, they may get themselves in trouble financially because the emotions and finances, as many people who work in the field of finance, they don't go too well together sometimes. As well, if there is an over-attachment to materiality or to money and wealth, well, that may commonly be seen when the moon is in the second house. But as well, it is a house of sustenance and nurturing. So very often people with the moon in the second house, they may work in a field that helps sustain or nurture other people. That could be anything from the basic needs, food, shelter, clothing, even sex. Because the second house, little known, it is attitudes towards sex as well, especially in the early years. But with the moon in the second house, there's a bit of vulnerability around things that sustain and nurture, around money and investments. For example, someone with moon in the second house might be the type to be defrauded a little more easily than other moon placements. Especially with some of these internet scammers, they play on the heartstrings of people. And moon in the second house, yes, they might be vulnerable to a sob story. Having said that, with the moon in other signs, such as Scorpio, Capricorn, and a few others, they actually would probably be a lot more wise to those kinds of things and not at all be vulnerable necessarily. It depends again how each of the planets are aspected as to how much these basic generalities I'm telling you will be manifested or not. The moon in the second house might also be nostalgic and attached to their childhood, memories, sentimentality. So it's not really a bad moon placement. And in fact, the moon may have something to do with how they make their money. It may not be seen in that second house or in the moon directly, but by relationships to other signs and other planets throughout the horoscope in work houses. The moon might actually be very much a part of it. It is even possible the moon in second house can be the type of person who would be like a workaholic, very emotionally attached to their job, their work, and getting ahead in life, having to seek higher status perhaps even. But moon in the second house can also be a very generous moon. Moon in the third house, they're emotionally attached to learning, education, and communication. In some signs, the moon in the third house can be very talkative, such as moon in the air signs or mutable signs. But with the moon in the third house in generally, there's almost an emotional need to learn. They need to communicate as well, and they in fact may be very emotionally attached to siblings, neighbors, peers, and friends as well, because the third house does deal with that. The moon in the third house may also have a love of travel as well as education, because both the third and the ninth houses tend to deal mostly with travel, or are the houses that deal mostly with travel, I should more correctly say. So the moon in the third house people, they may be very attached to education. They may be teachers, for example. And as well, they may be working in the travel industry because they have a need to see other places and to perhaps help guide others in that way as well. The moon is by sign and house placement is where you are emotionally attached. So moon and third house people, especially in fire signs, might be very emotionally attached to having a hot sports car or something like that. Normally Mercury, Mars, maybe even Jupiter would be more an indicator of that in the third house. But if the signs I mentioned, moon might be very attached to vehicles and travel and anything to do with that, or education. They also may be a great lover of reading, especially magazines and the lower communications, books, and things like that. Perhaps the internet and digital media if the moon is in an appropriate sign too. Now with the moon in fourth house, of course, that is the moon's natural house because it rules that house and the sign of Cancer. So you can almost bet that moon in the fourth house people, they love their home and they like to be homebodies almost no matter what sign that may be in. In general as well, they may be good cooks. Doesn't matter whether they're male or female, and they may certainly enjoy food as well. They may also enjoy decorating the home. They may enjoy outdoor work. Again, it may depend on someone's choice of gender or perhaps their age group, as well as the sign that the moon may be in. For example, a moon in Capricorn with a male may be more inclined to love all the outdoor work and leave the indoors to the spouse. But a female moon in the fourth house almost always is probably going to be the main cook, and a good cook at that. Or maybe not. Maybe they work in some other field that deals with the home, like real estate, home decor, home furnishings, or such things. The moon in the fourth house is also usually very attached to family. That can be parents, children, grandchildren, anybody. And that can be also more easily determined by other planets that may be there. For example, moon and Saturn in the fourth house, they'd be attached to older relatives. Moon and Jupiter in the fourth house, they may be attached to younger relatives. Moon and Venus in the fourth house, they're more attached to children or their spouse. So definitely the moon in the fourth house, though, is at home there and usually can manifest all the most wonderful things that the moon does deal with. Having said that, when the moon is afflicted or in negative traits, they may be very vulnerable in the home, and sometimes it might be an indicator of someone who suffered abuse in the home environment, either growing up or in a marital home environment as well. Again, it all depends on how that moon is aspected. Lastly, moon in the fourth house, they love the home so much they may work from home, and not just because of the pandemic forcing everybody to do so, although that could be an indicator of someone who's working from home and never has before because they have the moon in the fourth house perhaps. With the moon in the fifth house, remember the fifth house is the fun house. It's love and sex and love affairs and it's children of the mind, children of the body, hobbies, avocations that may become later a side gig even. So the moon in the fifth house usually is very emotionally attached to hobbies. In fact, with the moon, there tends to be a collector appeal to the moon because of its rulership of Cancer, and they're known to be collectors of everything from antiques to everything tiny to memorabilia. With the moon in the fifth house, they may collect lovers and boyfriends and girlfriends and such, but they also may be very attached to collecting something, and that something may be determined by the sign that it's in and how the moon is aspected as well. They may be also very attached to children and lovers and their spouse, yes, of course, with the moon in the fifth house, since it is the house where you're having fun with people. They may also treat their friends like family, because the moon is very much associated with family and the home. And as well, the moon in the 5th house may mother their lovers, their spouse, their children, no matter what sign it may be in and no matter what their sun sign may be. So there's very much a nurturing and sustaining aspect to the moon. And when it's in the 5th house of fun and creativity, you can almost bet, oh, and by the way, anyone who is artistic with the moon in the 5th house, their emotions would be very much thrown into that artwork and depict deep emotion, for example, no matter the art form. And as well, of course, there is a deep emotional attachment to children of the body as well as the children of the mind, something you can call the arts. With the moon in 6th house, you find people who are very devoted to service work very often. The 6th house is the house of work and service to others. It's also considered the house of Dharma, if you believe in reincarnation, or basically the reason why you're here on the planet. So with the moon in the 6th house, they're here to nurture others and to sustain others, but they also may be here to learn how to take care of themselves, because the moon is your own emotional needs and wants and desires as well. So with the moon in the 6th house, like in the 2nd house, they definitely have a deep attachment to their work very often, or again, their work may involve the home care, perhaps caring for other people. For example, a person who may take care of children or be a teacher may have moon in the 6th house. The moon also can be attached to health and healing. The moon isn't so much a healing planet as much as it is more a vulnerability. And when the moon is in the 6th house, in fact, the part of the body that the moon rules through its ruling sign Cancer is the stomach and the breasts. So people with moon in the 6th house definitely should be sure to have breast exams, no matter how that moon may be aspected. And as well, they need to watch their diet and digestion, because the moon rules the stomach, and therefore moon in the 6th house, especially when afflicted, may indicate food intolerances, food allergies, digestive type diseases like ulcers, Crohn's, colitis, etc. The moon in the 6th house also might worry a little too much about work. Depending on how it's aspected, they may feel insecure in their work. But I think that at the work environment, they're the mothers of the work environment. Moon in the 6th house are the people who will bring in the donuts and the sweets and little gifts at Christmas or what have you. So working with people with the moon in the 6th house, usually they're pretty nice, although sometimes they might be a little bit overbearing, a little bit over-personal, when of course with business you usually want to have some boundaries. With the moon in the 7th house, they're very deeply emotionally attached to their partner and relationships. And if that moon is really well aspected, they may marry well. They may have someone in their life who really deeply loves them. Almost always the moon in the 7th house is kind of lucky in love, and they deeply love their partner usually as well. Now, if that moon is afflicted and in certain signs, could even be multiple marriages, it could be victimized within a marriage, or it could be someone who victimizes their marital spouse, or a business partnership as well. There is a vulnerability to the moon in any house that it's in potentially. So moon in the 7th house, they may be vulnerable to being taken advantage of in partnerships. The 7th house is also the house of open enemies. I think the universe has quite a sense of humor that it's the house of marriage and the house of open enemies, because we certainly see that about 50% of marriages end in divorce. And it's interesting to see how people who thought they were so deeply in love end up hating each other. So yes, the moon in the 7th house can be vulnerable, but in general, it may be lucky in love, as I said, when it's well aspected, not so lucky if it's not aspected too well. With the moon in the 8th house, like the sun in the 8th house, perhaps not the best place for the moon to be. It may indicate some deep wounding that happened perhaps in childhood or at some other point in their life. And moon in the 8th house, they're difficult to get over emotional pains and hurts, no matter how it's aspected. On the negative side, moon in the 8th house can be victimized terribly in almost any sign. However, in the stronger signs, moon in the 8th house may be victimizing others. In what are considered to be the more gentle or softer signs, the moon in the 8th house may be the victims. Either way, victim-perpetrator games and situations often may occur with the moon in the 8th house. There also is more insecurity around joint finances with the moon in the 8th house, and also health problems. Same as I said for the 6th house, moon in the 8th house may be faced with exactly the same kind of health problems I mentioned when it was in the 6th, but additionally with moon in the 8th, sexual problems, and hormonal problems as well for both men, but especially women. An afflicted moon in the 8th house in a female's chart may indicate that she's unable to bear children. An afflicted moon in the 8th house for a male's chart may indicate a low sperm count or some other thing, a reason that they can't have children. The moon is more normally associated with females and women and motherhood, but of course the moon is also your emotional attachments. And with the moon in the 8th house, and it is a house of sex problems, it can be, well, unhealthy emotional attachments when it's afflicted in sex, but it can also be unhealthy physical sex health problems too. Of course, with the moon in the 8th house, really well aspected, there may not be any sex problem except maybe liking it too much. And with the moon in the 8th house, a place that deals with investments and joint finances, a planet of vulnerability like the moon in that 8th house is perhaps a little dangerous for the person. There may be, even at worst, or at best, insecurity around money and finances that may manifest as problems later on. And as well, there may be too much attachment to money and finances with the moon in the 8th house. And because it is a house of inheritance too, it could be that an inheritance is received through the maternal line, because it's the moon, and that usually relates to mother or mother's family. Now with the moon in the 9th house, you can guess it's a love of travel and a love of education. The moon is emotionally attached wherever it is. So when it's in the 9th house of philosophy, higher life learning, religion, higher education and travel and spirituality, ministry even, moon in the 9th house could work in any of those fields because they're so emotionally attached to what that house represents. Now, moon in Sagittarius in the 9th house, you can almost bet they're going to love philosophy and religion. Moon in Pisces or maybe Virgo in the 9th house, they may have a deep love of learning about healing and health education. But with the moon in the 9th house, there's also usually a deep love of travel, just like in the 3rd house. And those people will probably travel all over the place eventually because there is such an attachment to it. And as well, if they emigrated to another place, it is very possible that with the moon in the 9th house, they retain a very deep attachment to the home country and the home family. And in fact, there may be visiting family in foreign countries quite often when the moon is in the 9th house. When the moon is in the 10th house, that's not such a bad place for it for sure, but similar to in the 2nd and 6th house, there is an attachment to their career and their work. The moon, for example, one thing I've seen with the moon in the 10th house, actors very often have it because they are emoting in front of the public. The 10th house is the public, you see, and it is the house of fame and notoriety. So many actors do have moon in the 10th house. And if that doesn't matter whether it's even well aspected or negatively aspected, both seem to give some an ability to be a very good performer and a very good actor. Of course, that may be more augmented in certain signs like moon in Leo or other such signs that are more into the performing arts. Moon in Pisces, they may be a very well-known dancer or musician, for example. But with the moon in the 10th house, there is an attachment to fame or notoriety, and there is an attachment to wanting to be seen in the public, similar to the sun in the 10th house. But with the moon being emotional attachments, for example, I see today that today's society, I remember asking a young person, well, what do you want to do when you grow up? And they said, be famous. I said, but what do you want to do? And they said, it doesn't matter, I just want to be famous. And I think that that is a disservice we've done to a certain generation where we raise them to believe that that is really something that is fantastic when in fact it isn't. When you look at the way some celebrities are treated or how dirty laundry is aired, maybe that's not so healthy to have a negative moon, especially in the 10th house, because it could be someone who might be a fame hog or something. And as well, moon in the 10th house may act out and commit crimes or just not even care about society. They're just going to do what they want to and perhaps get themselves into trouble and have to go through the legal system maybe. The moon in the 10th house might also be very attached to politics and working in the government because, again, your moon is what you're attached to. And depending on the sign, they may want to have some control or some activity at least. Some moon in the 10th house people just really want to provide good public service. And there are some good politicians in the world, and I'll bet that some of them might have moon in the 10th house because they truly actually care about the public. With moon in the 11th house, of course, you'd have someone who's attached to charity, doing community work or service work. It's kind of similar to the Aquarius ruling the 11th house. There can be a great love of a certain group of people that a charity might represent. Very often, for example, somebody with the moon in the 11th house, if they lost their mother to a certain illness, they may then get involved with working in the charity that would serve people who would suffer from that illness or disease. With the moon in the 11th house as well, there may be a great interest in volunteer work because, again, they're emotionally attached to helping people. They may also be very much attached to friends. The 11th house being the polar opposite of the 5th house of fun. 5th house is maybe fun you might be getting involved with at home or in the public, but the 11th house is much more the fun and things that you do out. Going out to a movie, going out to a play, going out to a fundraising event. So the moon in the 11th house would be very attracted to those kinds of things for sure, no matter the sign that it's in. And as well, similar to the sun, the moon in the 11th house may indicate someone who adopts other people's children, or they're the adopted themselves. It could be that the moon in the 11th house had their early nurturing and early upbringing be very involved within the community or social services for one reason or another. Could be an abused wife, an abused child, an abused husband, sometimes it even happens. So the moon in the 11th house can be very vulnerable to those situations, but more often you see that they work in those kinds of fields, or they just have a deep attachment to charity work and fundraising and that kind of thing. With the moon in the 12th house, again, similar to the sun there and similar to the sun and moon in the 8th house, not the best place always for the moon to be. It depends on the sign. If, say somebody had moon in Aries or Leo in the 12th house, well, their emotional attachments would be very hidden in the 12th house. For example, you may not even see that they're a fiery type of person. They may come off as being more watery, more sensitive and emotional because of that moon in the 12th house. They also may be more vulnerable to perhaps some hidden problems. They may, moon in the 12th house could be, for example, that woman you work with who is abused at home, or the child you go to school with, or the young adult you go to school with who actually has a very disturbing or dark home life. Moon in the 12th house, of course, is not always bad. It is an attachment, though, to 12th house matters. So the moon in the 12th house might be someone who ends up working in a hospital, the prison system, government, secret service, or any special place where you have to have permissions or a certain education or a quality for being in that place of confinement or that special place. For example, if you're in a prison, it's because you work there or you're a criminal, and that's about it. Except sometimes maybe the moon traveling through the 12th house might have you visiting someone you know in jail. But with the natal placement of the moon in the 12th house, there also is some concern for some digestive ailments and other ailments similar to what I related to in the 6th and the 8th house. But in the 12th house, any health problems there might be more deeply hidden and also very hard to diagnose. Very often, the culprit is food intolerances, allergies, or other perhaps environmental allergies or intolerances. So if you have the moon in the 12th house and you have some unusual ailments, do explore what you're eating and what you're surrounding yourself with. It could be that you're having a reaction to it and it's hidden, it's unknown to you. In general, with the moon in the 12th house, people might be a little bit more secretive, certainly about their feelings. They're going to keep their feelings a lot more buried and inside than the average person. But as well, they may be involved with psychiatry. A person with moon in the 12th house could be a family therapist. They may be someone who is working as a doula, a midwife, in obstetrics even, if everything else in the horoscope is indicating working in medicine or healthcare field. So the moon in the 12th house is not always bad. And in fact, you often find it there in the horoscope charts of health practitioners and people that work with children or with women, or perhaps even with agencies that serve the needs of women and children because of the moon's relationships to that. I think lastly, we could say as well with the moon in the 12th house, sometimes, depending on what the sign is, they may not be so secretive. They just may be only willing to share their emotions and feelings with their closest relationships. But sometimes they don't even understand their own emotions. It's a little bit of a difficult place for the moon to be, to truly at times manifest what you feel, what you need, what you want and desire. And sometimes it can be very confusing because the 12th house is ruled by the planet of Neptune, which is a planet of confusion. So hopefully you had a better understanding of the moon through the houses and how it may affect you or people that you know. And again, if you don't know your moon placement but you'd like to find out, visit a website called astro.com where you can construct your horoscope for free and find out. Or you could also visit my website and get a personal horoscope reading from me, and I'll tell you all about your moon. Thank you for listening.